Boa tarde, caros colegas da Universidade de Vigo, e muito obrigada pelo vosso gentil convite. Neste seminário de doutoramento, eu vou trazer como tema da minha conferência interseções de género, livros e poder. Interesses convergentes em narrativas de mulheres e sobre mulheres em Timor-Leste. Irei compartilhar este trabalho em inglês. Muito obrigada. With this conference, I would like to discuss a few selected readings of political and theoretical texts on gender condition in Southeast Asia in general and in East Timor in particular, trying to establish their main concerns and guidelines. I intend to examine some values related to traditional female roles, as well as the strategies used to recognize women in political and social fields that are conventionally characterized by male dominance. However, the empowerment of women, both at the individual level and on a broader scale, in society and the nation, results in different ways, at different periods of history, as a consequence of cultural, economic, political, religious, social, and also individual circumstances. In this conference, I argued that localization and globalization, with its associated discursive productions, do not form a dichotomy. Localization is a significant dimension of globalization, in which local knowledge provides a dynamic tension with the global knowledge. The critical readings conducted in the course of this study led me to conclude that the search for local concepts ultimately generates new concepts, which encouraged challenge of epistemological and phenomenological adaptation when doing gender studies under a genuinely interdisciplinary and intercultural perspective. The title selected for this study allowed me to come up with three main theoretical concepts that are implicit common denominators of them all: life stories, thick descriptions, and cultural grids. These concepts were, in turn, used to underpin the critical analysis that is the ultimate purpose of the study, complemented and supported by further readings on history, politics, culture, and customs of East Timor. The construction of gender is a fluid and contingent process, characterized by challenges, ambivalences, and changes, so that any approach must be located within the network of ideological and material contexts of a nation, which is, by definition, a dynamic spatial mental territory. In a post-colonial world, and specifically in the post-colonial space of East Timor, the intersections of past and present, of the global and the local, of war and peace, define the guidelines to explore the negotiation and evolution of gender concepts. On the one hand, studies on the experience, understanding, representation, and daily renewal of gender issues examine the relationship of these factors with different types of social hierarchy acting in a given region. On the other hand, those studies reveal how different forms of consciousness and power elect bodies and sexualities as instance of validation and accomplishment of political, economic, and cultural transformations. The study of emergent gender issues has, therefore, to consider the existing connections between processes of gender construction, ways of negotiating everyday life, diverse forms of power and their related discourses, and the material forces that influence individuals, communities, nations, and transnational arenas. Contemporary reality emphasizes the contrast between different colonial formations in Southeast Asia, particularly in the region where religion, ethnicity, and nationality-related ideologies have influenced the experience and notions of gender in the post-colonial territory. Post-colonialism is understood here as synonymous with the current situation of former Western colonies, now located somewhere between the colonial legacy, the attempt to reach a national consciousness, and the politics of both armed and cultural conflict, in which different groups are trying at the same time to set their own identities, always under the strong influence of global hegemonies. Post-colonial societies, according to Achille Mbembe, are composed of plurality of spheres and arenas, each with its own logic, and yet likely to be interwoven with other logics in a continuous improvisation and negotiation. Under these conditions of mutability, political and cultural conflicts subsist within ideological contexts associated with religious orthodoxies, invasive forms of capitalism, and post-colonial nationalism, which communities express in a polyphony of narratives. This network of post-colonial ideologies influences the conditions, characteristics, and possibilities of negotiation and redefinition of gender-related issues. Western obsession with taxonomy and static controllable categories has described colonial and post-colonial Third World women as a whole, with a set of unifying and explanatory characteristics. But in reality, this epistemological conception of women as a whole is simultaneously disqualifying, sexist, and racist, and produces archetypes that fail to explain the material and immaterial diversity of the biography and social experience of most human beings. It is therefore essential to proceed with methodological precaution against universal categories in order to reveal the existential diversity of women and their differing agendas, while resisting the flattening tendencies of globalization. Women live in history, and in culture as well, and are themselves producers of self-conditioning facts and artifacts. Therefore, history has to be reassessed, not as a static product of memories of domination, but as a dynamic process where different women, through self-determination, with different methods, understandings, and rhythms, act and react while resisting being objects. Listening actively to the narratives of women from Southeast Asian transitional territories, like East Timor, requires translation, equivalence, dialogue, and negotiation resources in order to find points of convergence and divergence with dominant knowledge and thus build and implement concrete and specific strategies. But it is not enough to announce that dialogue is necessary. It is absolutely mandatory that dialogue actually happens and includes everybody, without discrimination, with justice and responsibility. One has to imagine other times and other spaces and be available to exercise the hermeneutics of suspicion on the alleged universality of Western thought. What does an account of everyday life have to contribute to the current discourse of gender studies in Southeast Asia, in particularly in East Timor? That is the question of the narrative of everyday practice, this first section of my essay and my conference here. Is everyday life similarly or differently manifested at the peripheries and semi-peripheries of the capitalist world system? How are the possibilities for emancipation inscribed in everyday practices, relationships, and events of specific individuals and groups, which may take the form of new potential for autonomy, dissent, or accommodation? What implications do recent transformations and old continuities in the nature of everyday life hold for the analysis of subjectivity, gender, ethnicity, identity, and sexuality? Those spaces that were once identified as universal, such as the great humanist narrative and tradition, the canon of great books, the public space associated with democratic communication, or the model of culture which sustained the ideal of citizenship. I repeat, what do these spaces have now been exposed as being essentially expressive of the values of the white, European, middle-class man? This is why life stories, everyday life, case studies, and interviews with women of every age, education, and background must be considered as seriously valuable materials for an insight study of gender in Southeast Asia, capable of generating encompassing theories. They are to be considered not as personal or familiar issues, but as social political issues, to which is possible to apply the methodological frameworks of feminism, post-colonialism, and study of diaspora. The previously silenced voices of these women, non-white, non-European, non-middle class, and non-male, certainly, and the narratives they produce, have to be given a new role and status in a modern, transnational, interdisciplinary cultural grid. Small voices instead of great books, the space of home instead of the public space. That is to say, the narrative of everyday common life, read and deciphered in their own context. Moreover, by listening to women's voices and their life stories, we learn about their experiences, real needs, doubts, fears, and requests. Because narratives of actual lives produced by human beings with a voice, a face, and a name, they create spaces of empathy, and consequently, projects of action and research will be conducted in order to obtain actual and useful results. The first reading, whose impressions I would like to share with you, refers to Step by Step, Women of East Timor, Stories of Resistance and Survival, by Jude Conway, which was published in Australia and East Timor in 2010. This work collects 13 oral narratives by East Timorese women who played major roles in the struggle for independence, either as guerrilla fighters, undercover agents, diplomats, or student leaders, both in the island and overseas. These women describe the reasons why they became involved in the struggle for East Timor's independence, in most cases due to direct experiences of repression and violence over their own lives and bodies, or those of their families and compatriots. The stories of these women of East Timor demonstrate how it was within homes and families that courage, adaptability, resistance, and resilience grew and spread through generations, from the clandestine movement inside the country to the international solidarity movement. Therefore, a new methodological perspective should use more appropriate terms to conceptualize the intra- and extra-family dynamics built around these women, and include approaches that will sustain in-depth researches, those thick descriptions, as Clifford Geertz says. I was saying deep researches or thick descriptions on those interactions and their associated meanings, practices, and local concepts. The power of these and many other oral histories resides in the immediacy and realism of their first-person narratives, published as they are while the protagonists are still alive. It is also significant that these stories have been published for a broader English-speaking readership. This personal and political approach to the historical record of an international conflict adds weight to the struggle for gender equality in East Timor. And this issue remains largely a conservative, male-dominated society. These women emphasize that the fight for equality was not introduced by foreigners, but has grown from within their own struggle for independence under highly oppressive colonial, traditional, social-political, and economic conditions. The Portuguese edition, Vozes das Mulheres de Timor-Leste, by Teresa Cunha, rescues the narratives of East Timorese women as an invaluable source of knowledge for the peace-building process. The women interviewed in Voices of East Timorese Women are students, senior political officers, mothers, workers, former guerrillas, and political prisoners. These long interviews take many directions and are made both of silences and spoken words. They are part of the author's experience as an observer participant and correspond to the traditional form of circulating knowledge in East Timor, oral narrative. The performative value of the words spoken and heard is crucial to understand the epistemological and methodological purposes of the work of Teresa Cunha in her attempt to respond to the conceptual dynamism of East Timorese society. These narratives derive from the tragic interaction between a past made of war and the uncertain future of political independence. Although these women and their narratives have been pushed towards the backdrop of history and thus remitted to subordination, they resist become mere shadows and actively establish the terms in which their present is built as part of society, a present that belongs to the state and the identity of East Timor. War in East Timor organized and systematized a severe silence, which resulted into widespread ignorance about the real situation of the territory and its people. The prime source of information about that space and time is discourse on the resistance to Indonesian occupation, whose authors and protagonists are men, a fact that complicates the access to other sources. One must bear in mind that, in times of war, the discourse of national solidarity overrides hegemonically any other discourse, particularly those addressing sexual equality and justice. Timorese women are found and perceived in this narrative of resistance as witnesses and as secondary victims of the essential story of male heroes in their national fight for independence. However, the narratives of these women compose the memory of East Timor, repeated as they are by word of mouth and occasionally registered in reports of conferences and political meetings. Some belong to women who, after death, became symbols of national independence, such as Rosa Mucchi Bonaparte, Isabel Lobato, and Maria Goretti, among others. Their words acquired status of unquestionable truths and documents, and over the years, somewhere between the myth and the history, eventually became a part of the legacy of resistance to future generations. These narratives are now part of history, sanctioned as they have been by official and orthodox reports of international institutions. The polyphony of narrative discourses by Timorese women represents a possibility for rupture, alternative and reinterpretation of the hegemonic notions about peace and war. Ambivalent and often contradictory, their voices emerge from a social, cultural, and political situation of both domination and colonization. These women at the same time reproduce and break stereotypes. They replicate the consequences of submission while giving rise to counter-hegemonies. They are subject to local constraints and also to the global networks acting in East Timor. Consequently, their discourses are tense, hybrid, and emerge halfway through war and peace. It is not yet possible to evaluate if these processes of negotiation generate more freedom, empowerment, and respect for women. However, their complexity is expressed by a multitude of voices that are both coherent and contradictory, complementary and conflicting, thus revealing the tensions between peace and violence, emancipation and oppression, cosmopolitanism and tradition in the peripheral and irrelevant territory according to hegemonic worldviews. The next point of this conference is called Narratives of Violence, the Everyday Practice of Terror. Among the narratives of everyday practice, a particular and sadly universal reality stands out, the narrative of violence, and this is a type of discourse generated by extreme poverty, strong relations of inequality, and close contact with terror and sheer survival on a daily basis. Old and new narratives and realities created by violence require an adequate vocabulary, with its polysemic words and metaphors, new words whose meanings are created and shared by the affected community. Because violence has to be described somehow and justified somehow too by both victims and perpetrators. Violence against women may take many forms, wear several masks, and play its hegemonic role in many scenarios. Whenever long guerrilla wars rage, women and children are their most vulnerable victims. But in many cases, women do more than passively suffer abuse and war crimes. They play an active and crucial role in resistance and survival. They develop coping mechanisms to take care of large families in their own. Many also organize with others, either to fight the enemy, often in a non-violent way, or to establish and sustain a support network for the armed resistance. In East Timor, the condition of women was exacerbated terribly by the Indonesian occupation. Not only did women participate fully in the struggle, preparing rations, carrying munitions, and acting as observers for the armed resistance, but they also fought alongside the men and undertook various clandestine functions. They also suffered horribly at the hands of the occupying forces. United Nations reports on human rights in East Timor for the period from January to November 1999 revealed that institutionalized violence against women continued in the periods before and after the Indonesian government-sanctioned ballot. In fact, from the day of the invasion, sexual violence and rape became hallmarks of the Indonesian occupation. Not only did the Indonesian army commit atrocities on East Timorese women, singling out the politically active for particular humiliation, but they also forced East Timorese men into public rape and killing of women. Children born of rape were likely to be abandoned or handed over to church orphanages. Women who were victims of rape were often, but not always, ostracized by their own families and communities, sometimes ending up in prostitution. Testimonies to the Commission for Reception, Truth and Reconciliation, set up in East Timor in 2002 to address the human rights violations since 1975, revealed that countless women were forced into prostitution by the Army of Occupation. The Indonesian military also used women as sex slaves, and those living in poor rural areas were particularly vulnerable to enforced slavery and prostitution. Another common practice of the occupying forces was to organize dance parties, forcing local women to join. Afterwards, they would abduct women to rape them or to take them as second wife during their stay in East Timor. Young unmarried women, in particular, were easy prey. When the soldier left East Timor, he would abandon his so-called wife and children, often without any support. One of the bravest but least known acts during the East Timorese resistance to Indonesian occupation occurred in November 1998, when over 20 Timorese women told their stories of surviving sexual violence to crowds of hundreds at a public meeting in Dili. The stories were collated into an English language book called Bui Bear, which means woman in Mumbai, the second most common Timorese language after Tetum. It was written only in English, published in Australia, and intended as an advocacy document for the international community. Between 1975 and 1999, there had only been 4 short but intense reports from international non-governmental organizations about gender-based persecution of women in East Timor, and no official United Nations comment whatsoever. In general, the international community ostensibly ignored the atrocities that were happening in East Timor. And this was poignantly outlined by Noam Chomsky in A New Generation Draws the Line, Kosovo, East Timor, and the Standards of the West, and I quote, "During the final phase of atrocities, a senior diplomat in Jakarta formulated the dilemma faced by the great power succinctly. Indonesia matters and East Timor doesn't. The point was elegantly phrased by the editor of the Paris left-wing journal Nouvel Observateur. History has its principal currents, and the principal current passes through Cambodia, not Timor." End unquote. In November 2001, in already independent East Timor, the local women's rights NGO East Timorese Women's Communication Forum, released a second version of Buibere, this time in Tetum, at a public event with many of the women who contributed stories to the book present. This second edition was intended to formally respect and honor the contribution of East Timorese women to independence and the high price they had to pay during the Indonesian occupation. Some of the problems that continue to face the women of East Timor were outlined by advocate Sister Maria de Lourdes Martins da Cruz at the launch, and I quote again. "A luta continua," she said, and described how the women of East Timor were still second-class citizens in their own land. A luta continua, and she described how girls still don't receive the same educational or employment opportunities as men. A luta continua, and she told of domestic violence still rampant, women still serving as slaves in their own homes, women bought and sold like commodities under the tradition of baride price, the barlak, and men leaders still unwilling to accept East Timorese women as their equals. Ovation after ovation shook the hall. This speech is striking in that in the eyes of those survivors present that day, independence did not necessarily mark the end of violence against women, just a new manifestation of violence and subordination. There appeared to be a clear linkage between the gender-based political persecution and violence by invading forces, understood as the burden of the feminine face of resistance, and endemic gender-based violence and inequality experienced by women as citizens in the transitional Timorese society. In fact, gender-based violence in East Timor is both an endemic problem and a legacy of the Indonesian occupation. Whatever the reality, it is a well-documented feature of post-conflict societies that domestic violence levels can rise even when peace has been re-established. Often, men and even older women, men and women who depend for their living on the work of their daughters and daughters-in-law, seek to return to social norms of the pre-war status. In practice, this presents problems, particularly when conflict has been a part of life for several generations, as the brutalizing aspects of war on human behavior are difficult to eradicate. War also changes gender roles, and women often find themselves fulfilling roles previously assigned to men, who find their former role as breadwinners usurped, or so they say. Widespread unemployment also causes bitterness and frustration, which may find expression in alcohol abuse and violence in the home. In Gender and Transitional Justice, the Women of East Timor, Susan Harris Rimmer seeks to answer the question of what role international law has played in relation to East Timorese women engaged with transitional justice processes. Despite the placement of women in some key decision-making positions within the transitional justice mechanism, Rimmer argues that women in East Timor generally did not receive tangible and satisfactory results from the justice system in the post-independence period. Where women have been recognized at all in the legal processes in East Timor, there is a danger that it has only led to marginalization and stigmatization of survivors of sexual violence. Trials have not contributed to a material rise of the basic living standards and status of women. There may also be negative consequences for survivors of domestic violence if there is no confidence in the judicial sector to acknowledge and protect women. Rimmer proposes an alternative way of addressing the situation of women by moving beyond ideas of women as victims or even survivors, by redefining what is to be a war veteran, so that women veterans may receive both maintenance and status in the new state. In her approach to criticism of the nationalist Turkish state, Özkaleli similarly argues that citizenship for those who are marginalized is a concept that fails to provide them necessarily political status or give them access to any meaningful hub of power. The political status of such outsiders shifts as they move towards being dissident citizens instead of mere marginal citizens. The latter status, outsiders, is that of a passive subject defined by a hegemonic center, whereas dissident, the status of being a dissident, challenge marginalization through civic activism. In reality, female combatants who served in the guerrilla army of East Timor were discriminated against throughout the fight for independence, and only following protests were they partially recognized as war veterans. Women fighters accepted that the struggle for their rights was not possible during the war. However, the same war created a group of highly skilled and motivated women who no longer accept widespread subordination and now work towards equality. But only now, with the war over, can women create and develop a separate identity alongside other international women's movements in a yet complex process. This process involves voicing opposition to former brothers in arms, with whom they formed families and communities in the recent past and now work to rebuild their country. In modern East Timorese society, history, the crucial and unique role of women in the resistance, has not yet been fully acknowledged, and this affects women's complete and active participation in society as well. Moreover, East Timor is still dominated by a male elite of military and political leaders who, despite their past as fighters in the resistance, have been responsible for episodes of violence such as the national crisis of 2006 and the attempted murder of President Ramos Horta in 2008. In the words of Sarah Niner, and I quote, "Such ongoing instability and an aggressive political culture favors a type of strong, militarized masculinity that marginalizes women, placing them in less visible traditional roles and has a negative effect on their status and political participation." End quote. The next section will focus on the nation's narrative and the gendering and engendering of East Timor. Ironically, women and the nation's historical narrative usually meet closer during periods of war, where women are the most defenseless victims, along with children. But in the aftermath, women also take part in rebuilding these same nations, both in colonial and post-colonial times. If history is another kind of narrative, what then is the role of female characters in it? According to the official discourse of independence and nation-building in Southeast Asia, women act as secondary characters in the nation's narrative because the very definition of national history is destined to exclude or marginalize women. Colonial and post-colonial history concentrates on issues like interstate diplomacy, political leadership, and warfare, where men play the dominant roles according to written sources that privilege male activities. In her introduction to Other Pasts, Women, Gender and History in Early Modern Southeast Asia, Professor Barbara Watson-Andaya stresses that when the national story has already been laid out according to certain accepted formulae, women can only be included as a kind of supplement or footnote. This has been especially evident in colonial and post-colonial history, where representations of nationalist movements and of the struggle against colonialism have been infused with masculine values and proved highly resistant to the incorporation of female characters and perspectives. Women are predominantly invisible characters in the narrative of East Timor as a nation, since most written accounts are focused on male leaders and fighters. However, over the last decade, a series of texts has been published not only by Timorese women, but also by international scholars, driven by the need to acknowledge the decisive role of female action during the struggle for independence. The book Independent Women, The Story of Women's Activism in East Timor by Irena Kristalis and Catherine Scott looks at the East Timorese journey from occupation to independence from the women's perspective and records the achievements of East Timorese women's movement, in particular during the decade leading up to the 1999 referendum. It also examines the challenges faced by women after independence by looking at efforts to consolidate the gains women made in wartime through the state and in civil society through pressure, advocacy, and attempts at cultural change, which is the main aspect. Independent women refers to the women's movement rather than to the feminist movement, because it is unclear to what extent East Timorese women identify with the term feminism as it is currently understood in the West. Indeed, some East Timorese women activists are motivated by feminist concepts such as equal rights, political emancipation, and liberation from subordinate and oppressive social roles. But the majority would simply describe their quest as one for great equality and a certain degree of economic independence and against violence, of course. Regardless of the designation they may choose for their cause, East Timor's women's activists do not wish to abandon their culture. Its diversity and richness provide them with a strong sense of identity, both as Timorese and as members of particular tribes. But they also want to preserve the independence and opportunities gained in wartime as men try to regain the ground they perceive they have lost. Although an embryonic women's movement preceded the Indonesian invasion, its character was shaped by the invasion and occupation, as were the lives of 2 generations of women. East Timorese women argued for constitutional guarantees of international standards, but also for affirmative action to correct gender imbalances. Although most male activists expected women to put the self-determination struggle first, gender considerations slowly crept into the resistance movement. President Suharto's fall from power changed the political situation in Indonesia and left East Timorese civil society with a moderate amount of freedom to organize. The referendum of 1999 was followed by a transition period from 2000 to 2002, preparing the way for full independence on 20 May 2002. During these 2 years, women activists from both inside the country and the diaspora worked ever closer together as they struggled to find the most effective ways to secure their rights and freedoms and to assert their interests in the emerging political and governmental institutions. But indeed, as it becomes evident, women have been and continue to be severely disadvantaged in East Timorese society. United Nations Development Programme representative Finn Reska-Nielsen aptly described their circumstances as follows. Poverty, I'm quoting, "Poverty in East Timor has a female face. 2/3 of women are illiterate. Many have large families, tend to seek children, and have heavy responsibilities within the household and the village. As a result, women's health suffers. The fact that mothers in East Timor are amongst the most likely in the world to die as a result of childbirth is a tragedy in the 21st century." Historically, in East Timor, women have been excluded from traditional decision-making processes, and they are still frequently prohibited the right to speak at community arbitration and adjudication sessions. In marked contrast to this, East Timor has actually boasted the greatest number of female members of parliament in Southeast Asia. That is to say, 27% of the Constituent Assembly seats in 2001 are held by women. Likewise, women have held high public offices such as Ministers of Finance and Justice, and they are commonly appointed as judges and public attorneys, whose authority is implicitly accepted by those same communities who continue to prohibit them from exercising any type of role in the local resolution of conflicts. In the article Equal Before the Law, Unequal in the Community, Education and Social Construction, a Female Authority in East Timor, Daniel Schroeder-Simeão addresses the fundamental issue of the different ways by which Timorese women had access to education during the past decades and even during the colonial regime, when urban and illiterate segments were set apart from other groups in the rural hinterland. This article by Simeão was published in English in Women and as the Theatre of Shadows, Women in the Portuguese Colonial Empire, and in Portuguese in the book Condição Feminina no Império Colonial Português, in 2008 both. Still using the knowledge of Daniel Simeão, who spent a large time in fieldwork in East Timor, this distinction became more marked throughout the period of Indonesian occupation and acquired new forms during the recent reconstruction of the state of East Timor. Hence, differences in recognized female authority, as the ones they stated above, are a product of the structural contrasts of the communities, which take into account those women's belonging to different lineages and generations, both at the state and the local level. In East Timor, tradition is deeply hierarchical and characterized by a strong symbolic dualism in the conception of the world, which sets clear gender distinctions in almost every domain of social life. Masculine and feminine are clearly opposite principles in several ethnical groups from the Eastern Islands, and the respect for this distinction occupies an important position on the maintenance of the cosmical order. In this cosmical distribution initiated by the Timorese lisan, or costumes, the sphere where political and/or juridical decisions are taken became definitely connected to the masculine principle. The village is still the public space for the traditional relationship among communal groups, according to whom women cannot be allowed into decision-making processes. Such crafty division of the world into different spheres of influence allows for the coexistence of different representations concerning gender relations and female authority. This fact should lead to a more careful reflection about some stereotypes concerning the position of women in East Timorese society and the sources of female simultaneous authority and lack of power in such scenario. Actually, education is the clue for the recognition of female empowerment when women perform roles such as judges, prosecutors, and ministers. Under the Portuguese colonial domain, the education of the daughters of the so-called Creole elite was the task of Catholic schools, namely the Canossian sisters. The Catholic education provided by those nuns marked a whole generation of women who fought for the independence. Actually, many women who took an active part in the resistance were Canossian sisters themselves. It is the period of Indonesian occupation, however, that made the access to education possible for many women who have recently become judges and prosecutors in the modern East Timorese state. If, during the Portuguese period, the access to female education was achieved through religion, another form of education was possible for certain young women, especially those from Dili, during the Indonesian period, a sort of more technical and less vocational education in Indonesian universities. In the course of their metropolitan experience in the universities of Bali and Jakarta, those women contacted with feminist movements which, together with the authority from their family origins and formal education, made them question the gender differential values of Timorese tradition, or lisan, the costumes. In such cases, distance was indeed perceived as a good advisor, and this escape was, as in many other cases, a way of searching for themselves, which takes different nuances for men and for women, as emancipation is understood as greater economic autonomy for men and greater social economy and authority for women. This is a concept developed by Paulo Castro Seixas, also in the consequence of his long stay for fieldwork in East Timor. At the same time, far from Dili and from the possibility of finding in the metropolitan education, either Portuguese or Indonesian, access to the sources of a new kind of authority, a large number of women from the countryside and the interland also had their track to authority traced by local genealogies. This was the profile of many of the congresswomen elected for the Timorese parliament. Such plurality of positions is surely a matter of disagreement, and it can explain the tendency of the women's movement in East Timor for dispersion. Only in Dili in 2003, there were 16 NGOs, all of them concerned with women's rights, many of them with the same purposes, fighting for the same resources. Such plurality also disturbs the elders of Timorese villages, who nonetheless seem to have dealt rather well with it, identifying a domain in which all categories become equal, the state, and a way to interrelate those categories, education. They keep the villages, however, as a niche of sexist traditions. This gender-related duality of criteria is one of the many dualities that pervade contemporary East Timorese society as a consequence of the conflict between different cultural and colonial models. Three models overlap in the present transitional stage: the Portuguese colonial model, the Indonesian neo-colonial model, and Anglophone post-colonial models, which interrelate in different ways, creating multiple hybrid identities. And now, as a conclusion, I would like to share my thoughts on some converging interests, empowerment, and intercultural transits in East Timor. As I was saying, these and other readings demonstrate how feminist analysis and intervention should be defined by neither distancing others, the other women, as counterpoles, nor drawing them close as facsimiles, but rather by locating itself among them, adapting Clifford Gertz's thought as he expressed it in Local Knowledge. Female empowerment means different things at different times in history, as a result of cultural, religious, economic, political, social, and also individual circumstances. In other words, empowerment needs to be perceived both as something that comes from the women themselves and something they can own with pride. In individualized forms of everyday resistance, this might be present. And as a strategy for action as well, implemented by governments and institutions alike. But this should be accepted and put into practice by society in general, not only by women. Because in reality, in male-dominated societies, though women may be permitted to engage in contained activism, those women mobilizing themselves around highly organized global feminist agendas are unlikely to receive such indulgence. Conversely, if women experience oppression in locally specific ways, these experiences are by no means simply local in their origin, and they cannot be effectively combated at a restricted, fragmented level alone, which will only yield limited effects. Feminism cannot ignore the global dimensions of gender issues any more than their locally specific manifestations. In East Timor, for instance, one can say that faith, religious faith, has empowered women to cope with extreme violence and repression during the Indonesian occupation. Later, in independent East Timor, the huge influence of Catholic religion also provided an alternative locus of leadership and role models for women. As a symbol of their cultural and identity, religious faith restores a sense of humanity, worth, and dignity. The same way, the power of memory has been one of the most subversive that East Timorese women possess. The memory of lost children and husbands drove them to keep on asking questions, to demand bodies, and not to rest until explanations were offered. Likewise, East Timorese native cultural practices are still very important and part of a complex, centuries-old social system. An obvious example are the traditions of barlak, which vary from place to place but commonly include the giving of presents from the groom's family to his future bride and family, and are often translated into English as dowry or bride price. It was initially constituted by a payment in cattle, though it has now been accepted to urban environments where the dowry is paid in cash. Barlak has been cited as a major cause for the oppression of women and the high levels of domestic violence in the country. But arguments surrounding barlak are part of a much wider debate, as it remains a foremost practice of Timorese indigenous culture, whose spiritual, cultural, and practical value some contemporary research has failed to understand. The main argument against barlak is that it is an unequal exchange of goods, favoring the woman's family while fostering the groom's family resentment against the bride, whose body and fertility are in addition perceived as commodities. However, some arguments go further deep into the cultural greeds of East Timor and seek to reposition the original definition and value of barlak, understood as a way to dignify women instead of a trading activity between families that eventually leads to domestic violence. On the obvious lack of consensus about what characterizes barlak, its meaning or relevance, the most accurate analysis can be found in the work by Kelly Silva, who also shared a large amount of time in fieldwork in East Timor. And for Kelly Silva, barlak stands at the center of a complex and ambiguous universe, with multiple moral operating systems strategically appropriated by social actors. The denial of barlak operates as a sign of social distinction between certain groups of the country's urban elite, thereby seeking to approach the standards of Western modernity as opposed to the habits of the so-called people of the mountains, the peasant mostly of them. Conversely, advocates of barlak argue that a woman who enters her husband's house by nothing or very little assumes a very subordinate position. Less than bargaining the bride's price, in fact, most people who practice barlak are eager to increase the offer as a tool to improve social status in the community. On the bride's side, a high price proves that she comes from a home and a family with roots, traditions, and ancestors, which are fundamental values in East Timor's culture, functioning as variables that determine relations of precedence between individuals and social groups. To conclude, in the vast cultural diversity of Southeast Asia, past and present, global and local converge in the analysis of concepts and issues of gender closely related to ongoing political, economic, social, and cultural transformations. Southeast Asia is an area of cultural intersection, as far as gender is concerned, of permanent cultural translation, that is, of reinterpretation, of repositioning of symbols and signs within existing hierarchies. In its critical readings, this essay, this conference, has attempted to share some sides, some positions that look beyond the arbitrary meanings directly or indirectly assigned to issues of gender, favoring contextualized interpretations that, in its permanent uncertainty, are likely to produce new hypotheses, theories, and explanations. This constant intercultural translation encourage the return to questions persistently excluded from hegemonic discourse, be it political, academic, or derived from plain common sense. And I'm here adopting the concept of return of the excluded by Judith Butler. Butler's thought seems to be more optimistic than the one expressed by Gayatri Spivak in Can Subaltern Speak? To whom, to Gayatri Spivak, historical and ideological factors have silenced the voices of those living in the national and global suburbs. To those excluded, whose epitome are non-Western women, and among them, the focus of this conference is Timorese women, Spivak does not grant Butler's hypothesis of return, as for her, Western feminism has contributed to the construction of that silence by denying a voice to the subaltern other. For Butler, the universal, here understood as a synonym of hegemony, that Gramscian combination of power and consent. The universal, I was saying, can only be conceptualized in articulation with its own peripheries. Thus, what has been excluded from the concept of universality forces this same concept from the outside, from the margins, to accept and include it again, which can only happen when the concept itself has evolved enough to include its own excluded. This pressure eventually leads to the rearticulation of the current concept of universality and its power, to the process through which universality readmits its own excluded, Butler calls translation. Cultural translation, as the return of the excluded, is a major force of contemporary democracy, challenging boundaries, fostering the evolution of society and opening new paths for emancipation through subversive practices that alter everyday social relations. For both Omi Baba and Boaventura de Sousa Santos, the potential for change lies in peripheries marked by hybridity. Peripheries like East Timor. And in these peripheries, newcomers such as the excluded who return, women, people of so-called third world, ethnic minorities, the poor, the oppressed in general, they have the possibility of using subversion to undermine the strategies of power, regardless of the shape this power may assume. Thank you so much for your attention.